Welcome to Reconquest on the Crusade Premium Channel, part of the Veritas Radio Network. This is Brother Andre Marie coming to you from St. Benedict Center in Richmond, New Hampshire. Our websites are Catholicism.org and Reconquest.net. My email address is bam@Catholicism.org. Should you have any suggestions or questions, again, bam@Catholicism.org. You can find me on Twitter @Brother_Andre, and I'm easily found on Facebook. Just search for Brother Andre Marie, and you will find me. This evening's episode is number 150, and it's called Canonizations, Infallible or Not. My guest is Mr. Ryan Grant. Ryan is the founder and managing editor of Mediatrix Press. He's a Latinist. He's a translator and scholar, particularly of the works of St. Robert Bellarmine, but that's not his exclusive area of interest. He's also currently an editor at Tan Books. Without any further ado, because we have a lot of material, we're going to get to our subject matter. But I think it's important for me to introduce the subject matter before I bring Ryan on. Now, there's no doubt, and nobody would contradict the fact that historically, the majority of theologians have taught that the process of canonization is infallible. Now, the Church herself has never defined this to be the case. In other words, there's never been an infallible definition concerning the infallibility of canonizations. But the theological weight is massively in favor of the position that when the Roman Pontiff canonizes a saint, it is an infallible declaration that the canonized person is indeed living the life of the blessed in heaven. Pope Paul VI began to reform, or some would say to deconstruct or to loosen, the historical process of canonization. Pope John Paul II continued that process in the norms that he codified in 1983. Beginning in Pope John Paul II's reign, which some have jokingly referred to as a saint factory, given the unprecedented number of canonizations, several controversial canonizations took place. But it was Pope Francis's canonizations of Pope John XXIII and of John Paul II himself on 27th of April 2014, and then especially recently his canonization of Pope Paul VI, along with Oscar Romero, on 14 October 2018, that serious controversy erupted in the traditional Catholic world. I say serious controversy. It's actually almost not controversy because it seems as if the preponderance of opinion is on the side that these are not infallible. A number of very respected traditional authors, including Dr. John Lamont, Dr. Peter Krasniewski, Mr. Christopher Ferrara, I should add Professor Roberto De Mattei, and some clerics as well, have insisted that these canonizations are questionable and may be seen as non-infallible acts. My guest this evening, also a respected traditionalist thinker and a man of considerable theological gravitas, that's my opinion, but hey, I'm the host, has publicly defended a position opposite that of the aforementioned luminaries. That is to say, Ryan Grant is very publicly defending what he says is, and what in fact is, the traditional affirmative position on the infallibility of canonizations. Before I bring Ryan on, I want to make 2 points. First, I have long defended the infallibility of canonizations and have come to something of a pragmatic position of my own on the matter of reconciling that with these recent controversial positions. But for the purposes of this interview, I'm not defending any position. I am rather seeking knowledge from a knowledgeable man. As a result, I may come off as agnostic or uncommitted on the issue, which I'm not. Second, I have just named several traditionalist luminaries. I respect these men very much, just as I respect Ryan. This is not about persons, nor is it about the publications for which they write. It is about a theological issue. And my effort will be to make this discussion one that is governed by gentlemanliness and Catholic charity. And lastly, remember, only jerks use ad hominem arguments, which is the best reason why you should never use them. So, without any further ado, I bring on Ryan Grant. Good evening, Ryan.
Good evening, brother. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome, and thank you for being had. I appreciate it. I appreciate it.
Well, I would put in in terms of theological gravitas, that I eschew the title of theologian in every chance I get, because rather than a theologian, I'm, the Latinist who is knowledgeable about what theologians teach. And so I never propound any thought as merely my own, but always more or less the historical witness of theology of various theologians whose works I have access to because I read them in the original Latin.
Okay, but at the very least, you're a most competent student of theology, and I would call you maybe a philo-theologian, a lover of theology.
Well, that's certainly true, especially when it concerns the tradition.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, okay, so just for the listenership, Ryan technically, and so of course I in no way, is a theologian because he doesn't have the technical credentials of the theologian. Yet you're talking about somebody who reads extensively in theological manuals in their original language, and who specializes in certain authors who are theologians properly so called, including Robert Bellarmine. So by most standards, this man knows way more theology than most so-called theologians.
I do have a bachelor's degree in it, but I don't really count that as much in terms of constituting someone a theologian. So,
yeah,
but I do have some theological training.
Okay, yeah. Okay, all right. Well. I mean, I think your qualifications speak for themselves when you read things that you've published and stated. Anyway, but let's forge on ahead. Your humility is duly noted. So why don't we just start with a bang? And can you? I realize I'm asking a rather large question, and I'm asking you to encapsulate a lot into perhaps a brief answer. But can you give us the principal reasons why it is that you believe canonizations by the Roman Pontiff, including the recent canonizations of Popes John the 23rd, John Paul II, and Paul VI, to be infallible acts?
Principally because the traditional theologians that address this question, and that is, as you rightly said in your introduction, the great preponderance of them, with many lengthy arguments and treatises on the subject, they devoted their whole lives to these questions, and they were definitely far more, not that this is the convicting argument or anything, but they were far more intelligent than any of us debating this issue today, all put together. And it's the rigorousness of their training and the depths of the knowledge, and it's clear reading their works that this was the case. So, for one, you have to take a moment of pause before you would depart from their teaching in general. That doesn't mean you can't in areas where there's the possibility, but ultimately, ever since the 18th century, there's been almost nobody and I mean that, almost nobody that questions canonizations until, of course, the current epoch after Vatican II. So amongst the theologians prior to the council, you can count them on your hand, at least from the 18th century onwards, who question the infallibility of canonizations. And so for me, the great concern is, and I understand the concern because I started my study from this because I saw a year ago that the canonization of Paul VI was coming down the pike. And I said, all right, that's going to be a problem because he is a problematic character. And, I don't want to have to say St. Paul VI unless I absolutely have to. So I need to get into what the theologians say, not merely what I feel about it, and see if I can find a way in which we can uphold the integrity of the papal office, the actual papal office in the Church's teaching of it, not the papalatria that's been so common today. And that's based on principles, not my own feelings or private judgment on the matter. And so that got me, just went straight to the preeminent work, which was that of Pope Benedict XIV. We'll mention him again on the canonization of the saints. And then from there followed through his citations, went through other manuals, more recent authors, older authors. And so basically what I discovered in this search is the traditional teaching has very clear reasons which none of the authors you mentioned have really seriously engaged, in my opinion, though they'd be good folks and on the side of the angels in terms of their writings and many of their great works for tradition. I really don't see that they've engaged the arguments of the theologians on the matter. So in my view, the tradition is a package, and we accept it or we don't. And more, I'm seeing traditionalists in their online argumentation saying, "Well, I don't like that. I don't feel," and it ultimately comes, I don't see how that could be without the greater study of what so many of these theologians have written. So I look at that and I say that's a problem, because that's essentially akin to modernism. Or it's, again, when you see people that say, well, unless you could show me an infallible proposition or a formal document from the Vatican, I'm not going to accept it. Well, wait a minute. That's what the modernists used to do, to throw out the tradition. Why are we taking the same course? And that's why I have to hold the brakes. And even though I myself was very skeptical and still somewhat uneasy, I should say, about the canonization of Pope Paul VI, Oscar Romero is another one, and there at least I don't know very much about his life. I just know that a lot of left-leaning liberation theologians are very keen on him. So that's one of those things that gives me pause. But I can't find a way in the theology that's been passed down by these great men of learning how I can say that canonizations are not infallible, and at the same time not run into consequences that put the entire papal office or the edifice of church teaching in danger.
Now, when we were having some of the sort of pre-discussion leading into this show, which was pretty much online, you had referred me to a work by Father Faber, the famous English Oratorian convert, wonderful devotional writer, but a man obviously who himself had some deep theological learning as well, because he wrote a defense of the canonization process and of canonizations. And I read the chapter that you sent me, and there's no doubt. I mean, he himself argues and brings forth numerous theological writers of his own time and mostly before, who clearly say that the theological that it is an infallible decision when the Pope canonizes a saint, that person is infallibly in heaven. So I mean, I'm not as deeply read on the subject as you. I've made lots of little consultations here and there, and there's no doubt in my mind, though, that the vast preponderance of the theological weight is totally on the side of the position you're defending. And as far as I know, all of the above noted controversialists who now are defending the position that it's non-infallible, at least since Vatican II, the process is non-infallible. They also admit that historically, this is what they're defending is not the traditional position. Although they in certain cases they would argue that due to certain changes, the process is no longer infallible. But they still admit what you just said and what I said in the introduction, that the theological weight of massive numbers of theologians is totally on the side of the infallibility of canonizations. Why don't we explain, or why don't you explain, what exactly is defined, or what exactly is delimited in a canonization? What is the Pope saying about this person when he canonizes the person?
That's actually a really good question, because a lot of people are under the impression that once someone's been canonized, that means that they were perfect and impeccable. And you see this in many different camps of where people line up in the church today, such as one time somebody raised a question in relation to St. John Paul II and said, well, the whole thing with Father Marcial Maciel Delgado really raises the question of what he knew and when he knew it. And someone immediately came on, well, that doesn't matter because he's a saint now. Well, that's actually not true. The saints, even while they lived a Catholic life, because we want to exclude, for example, St. Augustine, who lived poorly prior to his conversions. We want to exclude that. When you're living a Catholic life, there's steps along the intellectual life, and saints will make mistakes along the way. So it's not that the person was impeccable or that the even legitimate faults they had can never be criticized, but rather the Pope has basically just declared that they are in heaven. And really, functionally, as far as the infallibility of a canonization is concerned, nothing more. Everything else rests upon human prudence and human testimony, such as the decree on heroic virtues, the testimonies of witnesses, and all these things in the traditional canonization process, that, as well as the devil's advocate and so many other things, those all rest on a human witness. So when the Pope on the day at which it's appointed, comes out and declares that Beatus now enjoys heavenly bliss, that's essentially what he's declared. And to buttress that a little bit, I'm going to read from the theologian Tanqueray. Adolphe Tanqueray is a famous theologian around the early 20th through mid 20th century, and his manual was pretty standard in most seminaries around the world. And he basically summarizes what at least 100 other authors I could quote if I had the time to gather all the quotes in hand. Although I didn't have time to translate this, so this might sound a little choppy as I'm working sight reading it. But so. Proposition: in the canonization of the saints, the church is infallible. Common sententia communis et vera, common opinion and true. And we'll talk about common opinion in a minute. So it is proved first by the reasoning of theology. The church, let's see. So the infallibility of the church extends itself to matters of faith and morals. But canonization could be said to be, on the one hand, a matter of faith, for the honor which we show to the saints is a certain profession of faith, which, and he's quoting St. Thomas Aquinas here, which we believe to be the glory of the saints. And then he adds on, St. Thomas, quoting from St. Thomas, that this is also a matter of morals, because it would be a damnable error if someone were venerated as a saint who was in fact a sinner, because someone, knowing his sins, would knowing the man's sins, not his own, would believe this to be false. And if it should so happen, they could in fact be led to error. Therefore, the church cannot err in such matters. So then he says, next, it's proven by authority. For really, the Roman pontiffs in their bulls of canonization used the solemn words, Auctoritate Domini Nostri Jesu Christi et Apostolorum Petri et Pauli declaramus, definimus, decernimus. So that is by the authority of our Lord Jesus Christ and of the apostles Peter and Paul, we declare, define, and decree that this opinion, whereby they express most firmly the judgment, the sentence must be held. And then, for this very reason, theologians almost unanimously today hold that without the mark, the nota heresis, or the mark of heresy, it's a theological censure, or at least this of temerity, that this couldn't be, they cannot deny the infallibility of the church in canonization. So the nota heresis, the nota temeritatis, those are theological notes or censures that are given for propositions. Okay, and so obviously he says nota heresis, or at least temeritatis, because there's a debate in the tradition whether it could be held to be heretical, or rather merely of temerity, of rashness, to deny the common opinion.
Yeah, so Father Faber seems inclined to say that it's heretical, but then he says, well, in charity we should go with the softer position, which has more people arguing it, that it's at least temerity.
And Pope Benedict XIV says the very same thing in his treatise on the infallibility of canonizations, which is chapter 40 of book 1 of On the Canonization of the Saints. And he says there too that it shouldn't be held he enumerates all the authors, which actually it's a lot more than I thought, who thought it was heretical, because it was de fide, the proposition the church is infallible, and others who merely said that, well, no, it is common opinion, but we couldn't charge someone with heresy, but rather rashness. In fact, there's a few. It's worth reading some of the quotes here. So again, it's coming from Latin. I didn't have enough time to make the translation. So not Saint yet. Suarez. It is not lawful for the faithful to doubt about the glory of a canonized saint. And then he goes on to continue that after giving reasons very similar to what we heard above. That even though I don't think that this opinion is de fide, nevertheless it is certain that the contrary, that is to the infallibility of the church and canonization of the saints, is impious and temerarious.
So this is the great Counter-Reformation theologian Francisco Suarez.
That's right. And that's in De Fide, Disputatio, Disputation 5, etc. He also has a line about it on his work defending the church from the Anglican sect, which I forget I know that's in English somewhere online. I think Dr. Simpson did a translation of that, so it should be around. But anyway.
Okay, just a little reset here. You're listening to Reconquest on the Crusade Premium channel, part of the Veritas Radio Network. This is Brother Andre Marie, and I am interviewing Mr. Ryan Grant, and we're talking about canonizations, infallible or not. So you've just quoted from your site translating from Tanqueray's one of Tanqueray's theological manuals on the subject, and proving the point that, again, that most of the theologians following Pope Benedict XIV, who was a great, I believe he was a great canonist and a great theologian in his own right, Prospero Lorenzo Lambertini, and he was pope from 1740 to 1758. So, am I correct that he was both a theologian and a canonist of great renown?
Yes, he was, in both, and he has a high praise of St. Alphonsus Liguori, and of many, whatever his name's mentions, with celebrity amongst theologians. Although it does have to be noted quite correctly that his book on the canonization of saints was written as Prosper Lambertini. And even though he did issue a new edition as Pope, it is generally regarded to have more authority because of his learning and holiness, and later he was Pope. On the other hand, it does not confer upon it magisterial authority, and that does have to be noted from the outset.
Okay.
Just to an objection.
Okay, so just to reiterate, because you said that what I asked was a good question, and because I think a lot's going to hinge on this, what they're actually defining, and in the passage that you just cite translated, I don't know if it was from Suarez himself or if it was from Tanqueray himself. Okay, but he says that it'd be temerarious to doubt that they're in glory. He didn't say it'd be temerarious to doubt that they had heroic virtue, right?
He does, in that quote, he's not addressing the question of heroic virtue because that's a separate consideration. So he's only talking about the act of canonization in and of itself. And so in all the authors, it's basically an assumption that if he's got, theoretically, it's possible that somebody who's canonized doesn't hold heroic virtue to the degree that would normally be thought in the spiritual writers. And here, in the Catholic Encyclopedia in 1911, they have a quote on this. There's no question in the formula, and I did read the formula as it was given in Tanqueray, in honor of our office, we declare that this man is now, or X is now a saint, etc. And so they add, there's no question of heroic virtue in this formula. On the other hand, sanctity does not necessarily imply the exercise of heroic virtue, since one who had not hitherto practiced heroic virtue would, by the one transient heroic act in which he yielded up his life for Christ, have justly deserved to be considered a saint. The view seems all the more certain if we reflect on that all the arguments of theologians for papal infallibility and the canonization of saints are based on the fact that on such occasions the popes believe and assert that the decision which they publish is infallible. And that's following, and he's citing their Pesch in Praelectiones Dogmatica, Dogmaticae, sorry. And so there, of course, and it sounds more like in that particular section they're talking about a martyr, but there is a sense in which when you talk about spiritual writers talk about white martyrdom, people who suffer a great deal. So it is possible for someone to die heroically suffering. Now, did Pope Paul VI do this? And this is, of course, where even I have a lot of stumblings, like, from the outside where I sit, it doesn't seem like he had a life of heroic virtue. But on the other hand, I can't say that definitively.
Okay, yeah. Well, what I'd like to do is I'd like to read you a quote and then ask you a question, okay? So it's going to take me maybe, I don't know how long it's going to take me, but it won't be too long, okay? Ryan, are we there? Are we, okay. So so here's the quote. It's from okay, I'll tell you who it's from, but it's not like I'm attacking him. It's not, because we both respect him. Professor Roberto de Mattei. He says this: the exercise of reason, supported by a careful examination of the facts, shows quite clearly that the pontificate of John the 23rd was not to the benefit of the Church. If I had to admit that Pope Roncalli exercised virtue in a heroic way while carrying out his role of pontiff, I would undermine at the core the rational presuppositions of my faith. Okay, end quote from Professor de Mattei. Now, personally, I, Brother Andre, agree with that. And I could say the same of Paul VI, especially. I could say the same of John Paul II and mutatis mutandis of the Marxist Bishop Oscar Romero, who was a Marxist. I mean, he defended Marxism. Now, noting that the good professor is speaking as if the definition means John the 23rd were a really good pope, here's the question. Is it possible to have a certain, and I'll use the word minimalist, position on the infallibility of canonization, by which I mean one that holds that the infallible part of the canonization is that the person is in heaven, but allows the adherent of the position to reject the prudence of a particular canonization based upon the canonized individual's evident lack of heroic virtue during much of his public life, his obvious vices, his well-known immorality, and I'm not assigning immorality to any of these popes necessarily. I'm just saying it's possible. In other words, we know that by the mercy of God, even great scoundrels can get into heaven at the last minute. And while it's not prudent to canonize, routinely to canonize scoundrels, because they're hardly worthy of imitation or emulation, we must accept that such a person, if he were canonized, is in fact in heaven. Is that a tenable position?
Right. In my opinion, yes. And it's difficult because it's not formally addressed in the treatises I've dealt with, although I have not read them all. And so there may be more that go into questions like that. Could that happen? Because you have some examples. You have the good thief. And he did not live a life of heroic virtue, but yet he is held in the pious tradition to be Saint Dismas. And so for that to even be a valid or licit tradition, all right, and of course it's attested in Scripture. Christ said in all the theological writers, if you've read Bellarmine from any length of time in various questions, like in De Purgatorio, and again he brings it up in De Ecclesia Triumphante, which is what I'm in the middle of translating now, he brings up the example of the good thief, and and it's generally regarded that he went to heaven, and so that day, and he's regarded as a saint. But he did not live a life conspicuous for heroic virtue. Just at the end, he acknowledged our Lord, and our Lord told him, "This day you'll be with me in paradise." Yeah. So that's one example. It's a scripture example. Some might say, well, that doesn't really satisfy because that's in scripture. It's at different moments. All right, Celestine V. Celestine V's papacy was very disastrous. Yeah. He was you talk about that he did not manage his pontificate very well at all, and he set up the church for a schism. And so that's, again, he might have had certainly heroic virtue as a monk, but in terms of how he did not manage the papacy with heroic virtue. So just taking Professor de Mattei's words and applying them to Celestine V, we have another failure.
Yeah. Nobody contests that either. I mean, he was a great saint. He was a very holy man, but he was a miserable pope. But he quit.
Right. And Dr. Kwanzewski brings up a similar charge in terms of not managing the pontificate well in his article that was on 1 Peter 5. And there I'd have to actually agree with Karl Keating that wrote a counter to that saying, well, wait a minute there, that not, that they didn't manage the papacy well in and of itself is not a proof against their sanctity. Now, there might be very well other things in the case of these three popes. John the 23rd, I don't see it so much. Paul VI and John Paul II, you definitely see things that at least raise your eyebrows. The Assisi meetings are big things, which of course have been defended down the hill. I don't want to even go down that route at the moment. But so I see where they're coming from in saying that it doesn't seem to us that these guys practiced virtue, but from what I can tell in the tradition, because what makes the canonization infallible is not the process. The process is very good. I wish we had the old process. I wish we had it back because it made a lot of sense. And I'm not in favor of John Paul II's abandoning of the process. However, on the other hand, the process was never considered by any theologian as what made either a guarantee or the infallibility. Rather, everyone who argues this question argues that it is because of the assistance of the Holy Spirit in guiding the church that the Pope cannot err in making these making a canonization, and some even argue for beatification. Although all theologians hold, at least held before the council, immediately before the council, that beatifications were not infallible because it wasn't the definitive act. It was, or a final act. It was merely giving a permission for a public cult in various local areas or even universally, but it wasn't the final act where the church is now commanded to pray to this person.
Okay. So a lot of the objections that the traditionalist luminaries who are arguing against infallibility here of this process, a lot of their objections come from the actual change in the process, and you're saying the change in the process doesn't matter.
It's a red herring. As far as infallibility goes, it's a red herring. It's one of those things that you look in vain for an author that is going to appeal to the process as the root for, as the source for where the infallibility is conferred. Nobody says that. All right, and so rather they say it's the act. It is the final, and like the quote I read at the beginning from Tanqueray was one. Van Noort, who's another theologian before Vatican II, he says, more or less the same thing. A formal canonization, where he's not talking about equivalent canonization or what which is essentially how it worked in the first millennia of the church. He says a formal canonization is a final and definitive judgment whereby the Supreme Pontiff declares someone to have been received into heaven and also to be worshipped by all. Just a note on worship, colere, which means to cultivate something, and in the context, so like in paganism, means to worship. It's adopted by the church and the theologians, just the same word, and it's used for God and for the saints. And so in English, when we say, we venerate the saints, and we don't, it's the same word in Latin, right? And so we make the distinction, though, because they say colere cum dulia and colere cum latria, as to make their distinction. But we say worship and venerate to make it easier for our Protestant brethren to understand. No, we're not worshiping the saints. We only worship God.
Yeah. Technically we do worship the saints, but with the worship of dulia.
Yeah, rather than latria. But anyway, so continuing on this translation, so whereby the Supreme Pontiff declares someone to have been received and also in heaven and also to be venerated, to be worshipped. So to be worshipped, at least in this sense, that all the faithful are held to hold him as a saint and as worthy of public cult. This differs from beatification, which is not a definitive sentence, but a provisional, through which the cult is only permitted or at least is not universally commanded. We assert infallibility for canonization alone. For the judgment of beatification, since if by the mind of the church it is not definitive, would still, I'm sorry, I got to read ahead here because I'm still sight reading out of this text. It's still morally certain, but not infallible. Just the same, there are not lacking some theologians who judge that. And so anyway, but here it is, nothing at all about the process. It's what the Pope has declared. Right, and so it's proven, and he continues, from the persuasion of the church. For popes so speak in canonizing that it would appear that their judgments are infallible, right? And we saw the same argument in Tanqueray.
Yeah.
From the end and purpose of infallibility. Okay, and so he adds on that by this act, it would be, if a damned man were by a definitive judgment proposed to be the object of religious cult by all, don't you think that faith would suffer? Don't you think that, he adds, don't you think that morals would suffer if a member of the devil were now held up to be a member of virtue and the saints? Okay, so these do in fact touch faith and morals if the Pope would err on that. And here's actually an interesting thing, you haven't brought it up yet, but in all the writings of the aforementioned authors, de Mattei and Dr. Lamont, etc., they all mention, well, these can't be infallible because Vatican I tells us to be infallible, you have to meet all these conditions, right?
Yeah, Pastor Eternus. So yeah, and I was sort of nonplussed by that argument, but
it doesn't work. First of all, it's all dealt with in the authors that we've been mentioning, and that it could be mentioned ad nauseum.
They speak of secondary objects of infallibility, right? I mean,
right. Yes, and I was going to get to that. So, because there are different modes of infallibility, as we know. Obviously, it's the plain meaning of Scripture. You have, the infallibility that can be conferred by unanimous teaching throughout the tradition, such as by the fathers, or by the schoolmen, according to Pius IX's teaching in Tuus Libenter, that is, of the theologians of the universities, from roughly their beginning to their, to when the secular powers cut off the connection of the universities with the magisterium in the 17th and the upheavals of the 18th and 19th century. Then you have, the ordinary magisterium confirming what's been taught by previous magisteria and also in union with the fathers and the schoolmen, right? So all of those things can make it something infallible. It's just rather when the Pope speaks ex cathedra or with a council, now it is definitive and it is, been revealed from the beginning by Christ to the apostles. No theologian claims that the act of canonization, whether in re of a certain specific man, or is infallible because that was revealed by Christ to the apostles and passed down to us, explicitly or implicitly. Nobody argues that. So it's a non-argument, really. Rather, it's a secondary object of infallibility. And that's another thing where I have to kind of go back to Van Noort for a minute. Well, the Cardinal Franzlin talks about it too. But
Ludwig Ott writes about it, I think, pretty well and succinctly.
Yes, he does. In fact, I can read Ott on it first before I go to Van Noort. So Ott is talking about the secondary object of infallibility is truths of Christian teaching on faith and morals, which are not formally revealed, but which are closely connected with the teaching of revelation. Okay, and so he adds on, this doctrine is a necessary consequence of the doctrine of infallibility, which has the purpose of preserving and of truly interpreting the deposit of holy faith. The Church could not achieve this purpose if she could not infallibly decide regarding doctrines and actions which are intimately linked with revelation. She may exercise her power in these matters either positively by the determination of the truth or negatively by the rejection of the error opposed to truth. Okay, and this is how, for example, it was always taught in the tradition that is not odd. I'm talking. This is how in the tradition that they always said theological condemnations, formal condemnations of popes were infallible because it was according to this mode.
And of course, those things are not going to be in the deposit of faith. That Luther was a heretic isn't in the deposit of faith.
That passionate kissing when you're outside of the married state is okay as long as you don't as long as it doesn't proceed further. That's a condemned proposition, and that is infallible. It's not infallible because Christ handed this on to the apostles, etc., but because it's so consonant with moral principles that, and of course nobody wants to admit that today. Oh, that's so harsh and so rigid.
Yep.
But it's infallible as a secondary object of infallibility. And again, you look at a great amount of teaching in the moral theologians, it revolves around things like that. If anyone's read my translation of St. Alphonsus, you'll see the number of times he's referring back to these various condemned propositions, which is why he has them printed in the front of the book. So that because these are all secondary objects of infallibility. And there's been held by the Church as certain. Pius IX said you can go to St. Alphonsus and rely on him in the confessional without any other thing whatsoever. And again, you deny secondary objects of infallibility, all of this gets undone.
Yeah. Okay, Ryan, just to play, if I may play devil's advocate here for a moment, and now you say that the process doesn't matter. Okay, now we know that the role of the devil's advocate
for infallibility, I should say.
For infallibility? Okay, so let me just read you a quick passage from the Catholic Encyclopedia article on the Promotor Fidei, which is the proper name of the devil's advocate, right? The job of the Promotor Fidei was, quote, to prevent any rash decisions concerning miracles or virtues of the candidates for the honors of the altar. All documents of beatification and canonization processes must be submitted to his examination, and the difficulties and doubts he raises over the virtues and miracles are laid before the congregation and must be satisfactorily answered before any further steps can be taken in the process. It is his duty to suggest natural explanations for alleged miracles and even to bring forward human and selfish motives for deeds that have been accounted heroic virtues. Ellipsis, his duty requires him to prepare in writing all possible arguments, even at times seemingly slight, against the raising of one anyone to the honors of the altar. The interest and honor of the Church are concerned in preventing anyone from receiving those honors whose death is not juridically proven to have been, quote, precious in the sight of God, end quote. So he had a job to prevent rash decisions concerning miracles or the virtues of candidates for the honors of the altar. I mean, so
Right.
just myself sort of playing devil's advocate in this process, how would you address that? Look, the Catholic Encyclopedia weighs heavily the role of the devil's advocate. Answer that.
It weighs heavily the role, and he's like he says, to prevent rash decisions. But he doesn't say anywhere that rash decision couldn't happen. That at the same time, if it's, it could still be infallible by God's, and happen by God's permissive will. But at the same time, because again, we're talking about human prudence.
Mm-hmm.
You might have saints that are in fact in heaven, but it might be imprudent because of certain questions that would come up. So, for example, St. Thomas à Kempis, it's generally well known that some people say, why is he not a saint? Because when they opened up his coffin, there were scratch marks all over the top. They had actually buried him alive, and there was fear he might have despaired. So just because someone might have said he despaired, they abandoned the process, right? So it didn't even get to a devil's advocate, but that certainly would have been brought up by the promotor fidei if that had come down. So
and it does say to prevent any rash decisions concerning the miracles or virtues of the candidate. It doesn't say anything about rash decisions about him being in heaven.
Right, and that's what I was going to get to next. Is that it's wonderful, it's marvelous, and it shows a testimony to which that. In the past, the Church was careful in that they didn't want anyone, even if he was in heaven, that something could be brought against the honor and credit to the Church. And so that office is removed, and now we don't quite have that assurance that we have someone getting canonized that may, bring some kind of dishonor to the Church in some way, even though, yes, he is in heaven, and by God's, but the issue still comes down to the Pope, with the assistance of the Holy Spirit, is said by the theologians not to be able to err, because then the faithful would be commanded to worship somebody who was in hell as if he were in the glory of God in heaven. And so that becomes the problem. So before and after the council, before and after the removal of the promotor fidei, the thing that makes the canonization infallible is the same.
Uh-huh.
Before and after, and that's the issue. So now I'm not going to argue that the new process, we should think the new process is good just because it can happen. And on the contrary, I think it was a travesty that the process was reformed the way it was, and that they dispensed from miracles when they thought the need, or promoted miracles that were dubious nature, and including for Paul VI, that's another one where the miracle that they're offering. Nature is not in any way altered by what happened, right? The woman, the one the Vatican is claiming for Paul VI, I don't know about others, but for his canonization miracle, supposedly she was praying at the tomb of Paul VI. Maybe that's the miracle they're trying to offer, because nobody does that. But in all seriousness, then supposedly she was pregnant, and the doctors told her the baby had club feet, so therefore she should abort. And she went and prayed to the tomb of Paul VI, maybe, and then boom, the baby was born completely healthy. Now, this whole thing is fraught with problems all around, because this happens all the time. The doctors, because it's a very complicated area of diagnosis in vitro, and you don't know what in utero, in the womb, you just don't know what's really going on in there, and then unless you do very invasive and potentially harmful things like an amniocentesis or whatnot. And so you have all these problems that come about with making those kind of diagnoses. So then to turn around and claim that's a miracle, it's really sketchy, and frankly, it doesn't convince any faith.
Interestingly,
right?
both miracles for Paul VI, for both the beatification and the canonization, involved in utero infants, both of them.
Although it's interesting that that's the case, because then again, because of Humanae Vitae.
Yep.
So so that's another interesting facet on the other side. But at least the latter one. Yeah. As it's been suggested, it doesn't evince a lot of confidence.
Now,
but at the same time, it's not required per se. The miracles are supposed to be a divine testimony as to the fittingness that it's to go through, but the fact that the Pope can do it, and St. Peter's wasn't swallowed up or the Pope struck by lightning, shows that God allowed it by his permissive will.
And Father Faber points out that some of the earliest papal canonizations did not even cite miracles.
Right.
Now here's another issue about the process. Okay, so I don't want to keep harping on the process, but just one last point. Cardinal Amato said famously around the time of the beatification of John Paul II, he said this: Pope John Paul II is being beatified not because of his impact on history or on the Catholic Church, but because of the way that he lived the Christian virtues of faith, hope, and love. End quote. Now, as a matter of prudence, it's rather scandalous that they would say that he's being canonized not based upon his impact on the Catholic Church, because of course he was the Pope of the Catholic Church. It's like saying somebody's a father of a family being canonized, but we're not going to look into whether he lived well the virtues of a father or a husband. So, I mean, this is the reason why this question, and also the question of Dr. Kwasniewski, whose honesty I would not at all impugn. So, I mean, I just trust the man implicitly with making a factual claim. He says that an official he knows of the Holy See told him that they were given specific orders to rush Paul VI's canonization process. All of that stuff brings suspicion.
I don't doubt it.
Yeah, I don't for a second doubt it. But all that brings suspicion on the process.
Right.
Yet what you're saying, again, even in light of the fact that they have a clearly skewed outlook on what canonization is and what it's for, as far as promoting imitation of holy people and giving us examples, you're saying it doesn't disturb you that the process has been altered because the actual canonization done by the Pope is what's protected by the Holy Ghost, and saying only that this person is in the glory of heaven, and that's it.
Right. So it doesn't disturb me insofar as I have, based on the decree, I have confidence that this man now enjoys eternal glory, is with God in heaven, and can intercede. Because if that's so, then there should be rejoicing on that point. But at the same time, it does disturb me that they're taking the process and using it. Basically, it is, like everybody knows, to canonize Vatican II. That's the main point of it. But it doesn't follow that that is so just because that's the mind of everybody working this process. So just as, for example, St. John Capistrano, who most certainly promoted blood libel, right, in terms of the Jews. And, we don't have to honor that or imitate that or think that's a good thing, but he was a man of his time. He did things, as it seemed, although his friend, St. Bernard of Siena, counseled completely different activities in his dealings with the Jews. So nevertheless, we don't either, decanonize John Capistrano because of that point, nor do we, I'm sure that, the Anti-Defamation League would love that, but we don't do that on that account. And at the same time, we can honor him as a saint because of his virtues, and especially his heroism fighting the Turks, which probably isn't good for interreligious dialogue, but hey, we can look at that. Okay, well, this guy, he did do something wrong. We don't have to imitate that. And likewise, too, Celestine V, right? We don't have to fail in our office the way he did. And, we can acknowledge that they didn't quite do everything right. And in the case of Paul VI, the church is breaking down. Who knows that he didn't have a nervous breakdown? That may not be the case. I'm not a historian of the era of Paul VI, and I couldn't claim any explicit or direct knowledge of his interior life or of the way things worked. All I can say is that many of the things he did in his pontificate, just like that of St. John Paul II, disturbed me. But at the same time, I can say, we don't have to cede the ground to those who want to promote a canonization of Vatican II. Just because the canonization is infallible, we can say, but now you still have to deal with the tradition. And I think by rejecting this, we're falling into the same trap, because then, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So that, once we say, well, canonizations are not infallible, that's just, you don't have to, okay, well, now for the left, we don't have to accept Pius X because he didn't treat Herzl nicely, or we don't want to accept Pius IX because of the Mortara case. We want him de-beatified. We don't believe he's really in heaven, and that's not infallible. And then it can keep going wherever you want it to go. You don't have, and all of a sudden now you lose confidence. You have something you could say against any of the saints. I've seen people say, "Why did the Church canonize Thomas Aquinas?" Because but he doesn't seem to have had any real knowledge or intimacy with God because he writes so legalistically and rigoristically in his writings. And of course, when somebody says that, they don't know St. Thomas very well.
Yeah, I was going to say
but
that.
I'm just quoting what I've seen people say.
The adoro te
doesn't
devote.
understand why St. Thomas has been canonized, because he's got this facile and absurd von Balthasarian view, I would say, of St. Thomas.
Well, so how's about? I mean, I realize that I see the argument you're getting at, because it's like pulling a thread and you keep pulling it, and then eventually there's no sweater. But what about now? On the other hand, I'll say this: there's a gentleman who writes for a couple of websites. I met him once in Rome. You may even know him, Gregory DePipo. He made the observation, and I don't even know that he was taking a side on the present controversy, but he said, just because Pope St. Pius X is a great saint doesn't mean that I can't question his liturgical reforms, because there are a lot of people that object to, and even Bishop Athanasius Schneider recently questioned the prudence of Pope St. Pius X's reform of the Roman Breviary, which was kind of revolutionary.
It was huge.
Yeah.
In fact, if you get into, I don't have anything on hand, as years ago I was doing this particular research, but I remember reading someone, a liturgical author, arguing that the canon, or that the Psalter, was just as untouchable as the canon. Certain things, the breviary, especially in the writings, the histories of saints, they've come and gone, been altered, certain prayers, feast added, but the Psalter is essentially untouchable. And then Pius X changes the order of the Psalter. He's essentially broken the Psalter, and was even looking for more reforms, including adding St. Joseph to the canon. He was much in favor of that. And once the liturgists saw that the Psalter was untouchable, maybe the canon is not as untouchable as we thought either. And it really did set up the liturgical revolution of the next century. Doesn't mean Pius X wasn't a great saint. Doesn't mean he didn't have this great interior life and love of God. He shows very much the joy of holy living, right? As well as, so much childlike, holiness in terms of, he loved certain types of pranks. He loved, like there's a famous story of him at the altar. And the papal master of ceremonies was going on. It was used in his canonization against him by the promoter of the faith at his canonization. That the papal household theologian was going on and on and on forever and ever, without getting to any point. So Pius X, ordered his master of ceremonies to bring him a snuff box, and so he took, and right there at Mass he snuffed. And then the papal theologian took note and wrapped it up very quickly. And then he was so pleased with himself, he did it again at the canon, which I don't know if he was trying to, just because he was pleased with it, or because he thought he'd annoy somebody. And anyway, but you give things like that, but at the same time, we can still decry his liturgical reform in Divino Afatu there.
Yeah, and of course, so, I think we need to say, just in case the audience thinks that we're putting an equal sign between Pius X and John Paul II or Paul VI. Neither of us would actually take that comparison seriously.
Yeah, no, certainly not.
But
there's something to be said there, though, for something that wasn't good ultimately for the church. The consequences far beyond what he could have foreseen.
Well, to use Roberto de Mattei's argument, he says that the agenda is obviously, and I think he's right. I mean, I think, just to be honest, I think he's right.
Absolutely.
The agenda is to infallibilize this revolution with Vatican II and the liturgical revolution that followed it and all that.
Right.
Yet it doesn't.
Is the trick. They wanted to, no doubt, and then use the authority. Well, see, all these guys are saints, so you can't question it. The solution is you don't cede the ground. So, because, I mean, and I think it was Dr. Lamont in his article, again, nothing personal, right? So again, as far as I'm concerned, he and these other authors are on the side of the angels. But then he makes the argument that, well, it is just common, we shouldn't get the nota temeritatis for this. It's not temerarious to reject this. After all, and he cites Van Noort, who I've been reading, who calls it sententia communis. Although Van Noort says a little more than that, but at the same time, so he says, it's not wrong to deny something at sententia communis. Actually, it is. And if you look at Ott, among other theologians that write on the Notis Theologicis, they say it is actually it's temerarious to deny something that is the sententia communis without grave and sufficient reason. So the question is one instance where or like in this modern instance where you got something kind of, funky going on here with people whose lives aren't exactly absolutely perfect, is that enough reason to question the infallibility in the canonization? And I would say no, of course, for the many proofs that the theologians have given for this, namely that you wouldn't, the church would be led into error, right? And the church that touches both faith and morals, whereas our confession of faith and praying to the saints, as St. Thomas says, is manifest. And so it would actually be an issue of faith, right? But that's one. Two, let's say it wasn't infallible. I'm going to read from Cardinal Franzlin in his work, De Divina Traditione, and it's a shorter quote.
Ryan, I'm afraid we've run out of time. Do you want to do a part 2 of this next week?
I think we've more or less hit all the bases.
Okay. Well, I'm going to sign off for now, and then I'll talk to you after we sign off, because I don't want to go beyond my time. You've been listening to Reconquest on the Crusade Premium Channel, part of the Veritas Radio Network. God bless, and Mary keep you.